ISAC at Jacksonville and Protiviti would like to thank everybody for joining us today for building a, building a compliant and scalable security network presented by Lauren Kay and Ryan Briscoe from Protiviti. And just a reminder, everybody needs to be logged into the Zoom conference for at least 50 minutes in order to qualify for the CPE. And Martin Nash from Protiviti will be our facilitator today. And so at that, I will hand it over to Martin.
Thanks, Lucinda, and thanks everybody that is able to join. Hope everybody's doing well, staying safe and healthy, and we appreciate your attention and even any contributions. If there's any questions that you have, post those to the chat. So like Lucinda said, my name is Martin Nash, Managing Director with Protiviti in our Enterprise Application Solutions Group, and I'll be helping to kind of facilitate and moderate the presentation today. And we've got two folks from our team, Lauren Kay and Ryan Briscoe, that are going to provide a lot of knowledge and expertise. And Lauren is a senior manager in our Tampa office, has been with Protiviti for nearly 6 years now, or 7 years now. And Ryan is a senior consultant in our Atlanta office, who's been with Protiviti for just under 5 years. And like I said, both part of our team have a lot of experience in this area, and always willing to share their wisdom. Just one thing, kind of following up on what Lucinda mentioned. So there will also be, 3 polling questions that we're going to create, and you will have to answer those 3 in order to qualify and receive your CPE. And we'll be sure to kind of leave those up for enough time for everybody to respond. And you'll receive your CPE certificates probably within the next 2 to 3 weeks or so. I know we're coming up to the end of the year, but we will get those to you. So with that said, I'm going to turn this over to Lauren and Ryan to facilitate. And again, appreciate everybody's time today.
Yes, thanks, Martin. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to speak to you today on this topic. Holly, if you can click through, we can go through our agenda. So today we'll go through a couple different topics. We'll start with the security design approach, establishing a risk framework, developing compliant roles, implementing security governance, and then other security design considerations before we kick it off for Q&A. So feel free to put your questions in the chat like Martin said, and then we'll address those at the end. So next slide, we've got our first polling question that we'd like to ask. So if everyone could just read and respond once the poll pops up in Zoom. There we go. And we will share some of these answers. So this first question being, what describes your role within the organization that you are a part of? We'll give it about a minute or so. If you do have any technical difficulties, just let us know in the chat. Looks like it's not working for some. All right, Holly, let me know when we're up on the minute, and then we can share the results so everyone can see where we all come from.
We've got about 5 seconds.
Okay, so here's the breakdown of where everyone is at on the call. Looks like 34 audit, 44 IT security, and then 22 risk and compliance. So no finance folks in the room today. So hopefully all of you will get something out of today's discussion and can bring it back to your organizations. Each of these roles is crucial to developing a scalable security framework as we look at application security and how that relates to your environment. So we'll go to the next slide. Next slide. So the security design approach, next slide, Holly, if you don't mind. Thank you. So there are 3 different key components in building a scalable security framework. The first is establishing that risk framework, and that is really your foundation for all of security design. This really relates to segregation of duties conflicts and then sensitive access rule sets, which we'll talk a little bit about later today. But SOD conflicts, meaning if someone has access to perform 2 different functionalities, so AP voucher and then AP invoicing, making sure that we're monitoring access from that standpoint. And then we have sensitive access, and really sensitive access is just business transactional or functional access that we want to monitor for, not necessarily from a privileged access or IT standpoint that is encompassed, but looking at all different types of access that we want to monitor for and deem critical or sensitive to an organization. As part of building these SOD and sensitive access rule sets, there are different risk ranking frameworks that we'll dive into today. You may have something standard to your organization on how you rate risk when it comes to access, or we'll go through just a typical guideline of what we see and recommend out in the field. Part of understanding that risk ranking framework, though, is to get buy-in or agreements upon all the different key stakeholders within the project or the organization. So when you're establishing that risk framework, there's commonality and agreements moving forward on what to expect. How are we defining critical access? How are we defining low risk access? That way we're able to better prioritize the different issues that come up, and everyone understands and has that common goal. The second piece that we'll be speaking to you about today is developing compliant application rules. So whether maybe your major ERP is Oracle, PeopleSoft, SAP, so on and so forth, the rules and the best practice guidelines apply to all. We want to make sure that as you design, build, and test different roles within these applications, that they are conflict free, so meaning no segregation of duties conflicts, and you are establishing the risk framework as you move forward through those building processes. Another key to note is any new roles that are being developed within your application. Maybe it's designing from scratch or redesigning as maybe security issues were introduced. You do want to make sure that as you're mapping these new roles to users, that you are ensuring a clean and a clean security environment. So a lot of times what we do see is in the user provisioning process, people requesting access like or mirroring already an existing user. So when we do that and there's not clean roles established within the environment, we are reintroducing a lot of issues. So really making sure we have a solid and clean baseline for these roles. That way when we mirror access and like access in the provisioning process, that we are keeping and maintaining that clean environment. We also will be talking about how to identify mitigating controls for some of those higher risk segregation of duties conflicts. And then lastly, we'll dive into security governance. The goal being to continue to maintain the integrity of that environment, a conflict-free environment. So in doing so, we need to make sure that there's security processes in place to ensure that the user access is being reviewed, if there's areas that we can refine in the user provisioning process, and then also establishing role management procedures as we move forward. So that is what we will cover today. And then, so first we will start with that risk framework. And if you wouldn't mind, next slide, next 2 slides, Holly. Thank you. So like I mentioned, in order to create a risk framework, there's really that underlying basis of security that needs to be monitored, and that's your segregation of duties conflicts, and then your sensitive and critical access. So when we start with segregation of duties conflicts, this is making sure that the roles within a user's or a person's job is being appropriately segregated to ensure that we're not having end-to-end process without any type of mitigating controls. Really, the best practice is to ensure that we are giving users access based on task or role-based roles. That way we can start to clean up the environment and make sure that we're able to better monitor who has what access moving forward. At different times, there's individuals or team members that can split up this type of functionality to help with SOD, but we need to make sure that we scope in the appropriate conflicts based on your risk appetite, the application, the industry, and the nature of your job. So establishing what SOD conflicts you'd like to look for is the first step in developing that rule set. Then from a sensitive access standpoint, we can look at each side of those conflicts and monitor that access. A lot of times we are looking for master data, any transactional access. When it comes to reporting or view only, typically that's not scoped in as it's lower risk. So we're really wanting to monitor that transactional access and any user that has the ability to update, edit, modify, delete. Okay, so those are the two basic rule sets that we want to establish as far as that framework. And then based on that rule set, we'll go into the risk rankings, and then in a little bit, we'll show you it all together and what that looks like. Next slide, Holly, if you don't mind. Okay, so like I mentioned, here's an example of what a formal risk ranking guideline can look like. Now, this can be different from organizations and industries, but typically this is what we see as far as a best practice. So we have rankings all the way from critical to low. The risk descriptions clearly stated for each of the different levels. And then we've got a required action on the far right-hand column, and we'll get to that in a minute. So some of the critical risks that we typically see are related to user management, table access, approval authority, anything within the application that really needs to be restricted or not assigned at all. Then we've got, from a high risk standpoint, these are multiple areas directly related to financial reporting maybe, or areas that could present different risks or fraud with financial misstatements or industry compliant areas. Then we move on to our medium risks, and there are multiple areas that could lead to issues maybe with data integrity. We don't necessarily define it as high risk, but it is something that we want to monitor and maintain visibility into. And then lastly, we've got the low risk area. These are, again, something we want to monitor, not necessarily action being required from these, but it's good to have that insight into what users have access to these risks. So in the far right column, these are some of the required actions. So we talk about with critical access, remediation is required if a user has access to maybe an SOD conflict that's considered critical access. We need to remove the access, or we need to maybe redesign or adjust a role so that the access is removed. This is a good column in a way to really distinguish if you're maybe between two, if you're between a medium or a high risk when coming up with that risk ranking. Being able to see from a high risk, remediation's preferred, but we do need a mitigating control in place if someone is going to be assigned a high risk SOD conflict. Whereas if you look at the medium, we prefer a mitigation to be in place, but there's no action required as far as removing access or cleanup in a role standpoint. So again, this is just a typical guideline of how risks can be defined and making sure everyone's in agreement before assigning these into your segregation of duties or sensitive access rule sets. Now, next slide, to tie this all together, we have developing that SOD rule set. Now, this is an example that's specific to Oracle from an application standpoint. So at the top line, we've picked an SOD, supplier master and AP payments. For the sake of the example, we've got listed here the risk ranking and the risk description for this organization, or as an example. We've determined that this is a high risk. So going back to that risk ranking slide, this is a remediations preferred, and then in addition to that, mitigation is required. That's what we had defined as a high risk. Then we have the risk description stated here, specific for the supplier master and AP payments listed. And then we've got broken out the two different business processes, supplier master being one side and then AP payments being the other. Each of those two would then be incorporated into your sensitive access rule set to monitor for. But right now, from an SOD perspective, we're looking at who has access to both AP payments and supplier master. So that's the front-facing rule set. And then underneath, you've got that technical or functional mapping. So we're saying that as part of the supplier master, these are the different objects that we're looking for. And then on the AP payment side, those are the other objects that we're looking for. So this, your technical mapping, and then your descriptions, your risk rankings, that incorporates or comes to your full rule set as we look in defining our segregation of duties. So then as an example, this was just one that would be part of the SOD rule set. So you could have anywhere from 10 to 50 different SODs you're maybe looking for. The important part is just making sure you're scoping it to be explicitly clear for your industry and any compliance regulations that you have, that these are the ones that you want to monitor for. If you look at too little, you could be missing something. If you look at too many, you could be adding a bunch of noise that's really distracting from your true risk. So making sure you have a good scoping or discovery session prior to developing your rule sets is very important. Okay, so the next slide, this is related to your different types of SOD risks to consider. So we have a few listed. The first one being any master data and transactions. So we want to avoid users with access to having the access or the ability to update any of those master data elements and then being able to perform a transaction. Same with the configurations and transactions, looking for any key configurations or application control updates, as well as performing that transaction. Number 3, this is the transactions within the same process. So, you know, an example of this could be creating an inappropriate invoice and then processing that payment of that invoice. So we want to make sure that this is either separated or there's mitigating controls in place, like a reconciliation or some type of review. The fourth one, any transactional access and then audit log updates. So in theory, you know, you could perform inappropriate or fraudulent transaction and then conceal it through that audit log update. And then lastly, any transactional access and reconciliations. So I would say the first two and the last two, a lot of times we do see IT team members having access to both, even most of the time not knowing that they do have that transactional access. So this is really important to make sure that IT roles are specific for IT users, where business roles are specific and assigned to only business users. All right, next slide, where we'll go into developing compliant roles. So I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Lauren. So now that we've kind of gone through the risk ranking framework and everything, we're going to move on into developing compliant roles. And based on the feedback that Lauren's explained about making sure we maintain conflict-free roles, or at least mitigating roles as we can with appropriate mitigating controls, we'll display this poll question, if you don't mind moving forward, Holly. And we'll give you a chance to give us your feedback based on what Lauren just taught us.
All right, we will give it about 10 more seconds.
Looks like a 50-50 split. So as Lauren was mentioning, basically you want to make sure that you don't incorporate any intra-role conflicts in your security design if possible. And if they are of high risk, you do want to make sure that you maintain mitigating controls and review those regularly along with the access assignments. We can move forward to the next slide, Holly. All right, so based on the feedback that Lauren gave us around the risks associated with application security, we want to make sure that we're now incorporating those considerations into our application security design. So most standard application security models come with out-of-the-box or seeded security roles that can be assigned directly to users. A lot of times that our clients will see this around an implementation or directly following an implementation, as these seeded roles often have the access required to do application setups, and they also can do some of the standard business functionality that you would see end users needing to do day to day. This may sound somewhat intuitive based on efficiency, but this actually can pose significant risk to your business if you go about assigning access with these seeded roles. And that's because there's often inherent access that comes along with these roles that isn't immediately available, and it's often elevated access. So take, for example, the user in the slide here. If they needed to have the access they needed to perform their day-to-day operations as a financial analyst, they may need to touch several different business processes in some limited fashion. To do that from a seeded role perspective, you would need to assign them several different seeded roles. And like I just mentioned, that would often come along with a lot of unnecessary access or access that you may not even be aware of. And due to this can pose significant access risk, and it reduces the visibility into the risk associated with the access that users have. So some examples of this type of access that we've seen that comes along with these seeded roles at our clients are non-IT roles that have implementation access that can circumvent the traditional navigation of menu paths, finance roles that allow a user to modify setups related to the transactions that the user can actually transact on, and then like non-GL roles having the ability to actually enter manual journal entries, and that's not something we would typically want to see. You can move forward to the next slide, Holly. And so here on the next slide, as I mentioned, these roles often come with an elevated access with them that you aren't really getting the visibility into as they're assigned. And this not only creates sensitive access risks, like Laura mentioned, of just elevated access or access that should always be reviewed regularly, but it also can create segregation of duties risk. And so in this example here, based on the additional access that our user was assigned with these seeded roles, it actually created a segregation of duties risk between two of those roles. So in this example, the payables manager granted the user access to basically process payments, and then the payables manager actually granted them access to update supplier information, and the purchasing super user actually granted them access to process payments. And so you wouldn't want to see that, right? Because if a user has access to update supplier information, they could update a bank account. And then after they update a bank account, they could put their own information in there, process a payment, and then come back and conceal that information. So that's an example of a SOD conflict that has resulted from two different seeded roles being assigned. But there's also a common misconception that the roles themselves come out of the box without any inherent conflicts. And some of these can even be considered high risk. So for example, there are a few examples I've got below in the next coming slides that will show these specifically, but a couple of high-level examples are the ability for a user to modify a customer and then create a transaction, for a user to either enter or modify GL setups and then also create a journal entry, and then the ability for a user to modify payroll setups and also process payroll runs. So like I said, these are all SOD conflicts that actually inherently exist within the out-of-the-box application role, and that means that the user automatically assumes that risk when they're assigned that role. You can move to the next slide, Holly. So in this slide and the following slide as well, you'll see some screenshot examples we've taken of some real world examples of these inherent conflicts that exist within some of these seeded roles. So we've used Oracle Cloud as our example platform here. And as you can see, this user has been assigned the payables manager job role. And so at a high level, it just has access to a broad range of payables activities. In this example, you can see that this role grants the user access to manually enter and then post a subledger entry. And you can see by the types of data that is captured by the subledger entry that this actually could be conceived as a system role instead of actually transacting through the normal process a journal would go through in the typical approval process. So again, looking at this from the outside in, you might think that this was just a typical system transaction, but this was actually created by a user using this seeded role. You can move forward to the next slide, Holly. So in this example, the last example is more demonstrating elevated access, just access you wouldn't typically see a user having access to, but not necessarily creating a SOD conflict. And in this example, we show an actual inherent conflict that does exist within one of these seeded roles. So in this example, the user is granted receivables manager. That's another Oracle job role. And this has given the user access to both create customers and create transactions. So this introduces the risk of a user being able to create an inappropriate receivables and then being able to inappropriately inflate revenues. And that obviously from a risk perspective and a scalability perspective, you would want to make sure that this access was segregated appropriately, at least not within a single role. If your organization does need to have functionality like this within a single user's ability, we would at least expect that access be segregated into two different roles, so then you could scale it beyond that user if there was ever a need or a reason to then take that role and give it to another user. And if it does reside with a single user, we do always suggest making sure there's a mitigating control in place to make sure that any risk associated with that access is managed appropriately. You can move to the next slide, Holly. So based on the risks we've gone over, and there are definitely many other risks associated with seeded responsibilities that we won't have time to cover today, it can definitely be discerned that out-of-the-box security is not best practice and definitely can lead to increased risks of fraud, potential manual error, or compliance deficiencies. And the latter, just to expound on that, recently the PCAOB has ratcheted up pressure on external auditors to make sure that companies are abiding by appropriate access risk management policies and making sure segregation of duties are handled appropriately. So based on that, you're posed with the problem for the organization. How do you solve this problem? And our suggestion is by creating custom roles that can address these concerns. So how do we do that? The idea is by developing roles that tailor access to specific business requirements, your organization can reduce the excessive access risks and the SOD risks that are inherent to some of these roles, the seeded roles. You can gain more visibility into the specific access risks that users have. And then your organization can optimize their security design for scalability. If you have a role design that has specific functional roles, you can easily scale that up and down as a business expands or contracts. You can move to the next slide, Holly. You can go one more, Holly. I think this might be, there you go. Thank you. And so in this slide, you can see by the example, when you have these roles siloed, like we just mentioned by functional access role, you can give all the access that the user required in the previous examples through the seeded roles to the user, and you have the visibility into the specific access that the user has at that point. And that you can then scale that beyond that user to additional users if there's ever a need or a reason to segregate that access outside of a single user. You can move to the next slide, Holly. Again, based on the conversation we just had and on the previous example, this example also makes sure that you can reduce all the elevated access that was contributing to the known or unknown SOD conflicts that was caused between two of the seeded roles. And then in addition, if there were any inherent conflicts within any of those seeded roles, by using this design, you wouldn't be assuming those at the user level. You can move forward now, Holly. So now that we have an understanding of the problem and what the solution may be, how do we go about doing that? This is an overall approach at what a security design may look like in terms of phases and some basic KPIs that we would assume at each phase. We basically use this slide to kind of set expectations on what the general methodology is for an implementation, and kind of set general expectations on what the end result may look like. So as you see here, you have the standard phases of most any implementation of an IT project, but this is specific to security. You can see there's the design, build, unit testing, user acceptance testing, user mapping, day in the life of, or DITL, go live, and hypercare phases. One of the things we like to highlight here is that it's important to set expectations with your stakeholders and your end users on what the implementations involves, and what the activities will be, and what is required of them. Security transformation is a journey, it's not a sprint, and it takes everyone's involvement to get through each of these steps to make the model more secure. It's important to note that also a lot of these steps are iterative. So say you go into the build phase and you notice an issue, or you need to tweak something and you may have to go back to the design phase. A lot of these are iterative processes like that. Same thing with testing, that you may have to go through several times in order to complete the implementation. So just to touch on the security, the KPIs involved with each of these phases. These are just general guidelines we like to see followed to make sure that as you go through the implementation, you are moving towards that 100% accuracy of your role design. So at the design phase, we'd like to see about 65% accuracy. Once you've done the unit testing and filtered through your initial issues, we would like to see about 70%. After you've done your user acceptance testing and moved through your day in the life of testing, we'd like to see it more around 95%. So you're just tweaking those last couple of issues at that point. And then after that, moving into hypercare, we want to make sure you're at that 100% mark and we've gotten it over the finish line, making sure that users have what they need, and everything is secure and functioning as it should be. So like I said earlier, just to expound and reiterate, it's an iterative process and you got to make sure that you set expectations, but you're going to have issues. And when you do have issues, just work diligently to resolve those, keep going back through and building, testing, and documenting, and you will end up with a complete and accurate functioning security model at the end. You can move to the next slide, Holly. So the first phase, and what I'm going to do here is basically go through individually by phase and give you a little more insight into what each involves. And we'll start with design. So you're kicking your project off with design, and you want to make sure that your role design is aligned with your SOD rule set and your risk framework that Holly mentioned earlier in the presentation. So I won't go into detail on that, but basically you're taking that information, you're going through thorough workshops with your business process owners and audit, making sure that any of those organizational risks that you've identified that fall within the functionality of your security model are being addressed. You're documenting any mitigating controls that go along with that to make sure that you can map those as necessary. And then following that, making sure you get any additional feedback on the scope of the framework and making sure it's customized to what you need for the actual project. So making sure that if you're only including 3 or 4 modules, you're scoping your risk specific to those, making sure you have all the information around those, and making sure that the design is appropriate and considers those risks. After you've done that, you'll conduct a baseline SOD assessment as part of this phase, and that basically just makes sure that you have an idea of where you're starting at, and you can build upon that as you're going forward. One important thing, and Lauren will touch on this later, is making sure that you have the correct stakeholders involved. And so that's in order to make sure you gather complete requirements and give yourself a better chance at ensuring satisfaction and project success, and adoption by all of your end users. So one of the groups that often gets looked over in this is internal audit, and I'll speak specifically to that. Like I said, Lauren will touch on the others more in depth in a little bit, but by involving internal audit early, you're giving them access to your process and making sure that you have the appropriate risk covered as part of your design. And then they'll also help you along the way, giving you ongoing feedback, making sure you're doing proper testing, you're getting the proper approvals and documentation. And then at the end, you have all that you need to successfully go live and maintain compliance through that. So that's something I want to call out because I do feel like that often gets overlooked. Once you're done with the design phase, you move into the build phase. Build is build like it sounds. That's when you're starting your development of your roles in the development environment. Once you move into that phase, it's more of an iterative process of building upon what the design is and making sure that as you go, you're tweaking appropriately, and you're making sure that you're constantly analyzing for risk from an SOD perspective, making sure that at the end of the day, you've got a clean and functioning build ready for testing. Once the build is complete, you'll make sure that you've updated all of your documentation, you've got your approvals, and you'll move forward into the unit testing phase. When you move into the unit testing phase, I think a lot of people often do unit testing, but don't do thorough unit testing, thinking that UAT will cover a lot of unit testing. And a lot of times that is true, right? But at the end of the day, I think it's important to understand how important unit testing is, because if you do proper unit testing up front, making sure that everything's functioning as expected, or at least to the extent possible, you're setting yourself up for a much more pleasant experience in user acceptance testing. So as you're going through unit testing, you're identifying these issues, you're making sure you're making the necessary tweaks and documenting those appropriately, setting all that up ahead of time so that when you roll these users out with these roles in user acceptance testing, that you don't run into these same issues and you're only identifying net new issues. More so to that aspect as well, make sure that you do maintain proper documentation and evidence of unit testing. It doesn't necessarily have to be as thorough as your UAT documentation, but it is important to show that you went through the proper steps in order to unit test the roles. All right, Holly, you can move on to the next slide. All right, so after you've wrapped up unit testing, you're ready to move into user acceptance testing. Before you formally start that, you want to make sure that you document your user's acceptance criteria, so you're making sure that you understand what the end users of the product and the security model need. And you've already done that in business requirements as well, but you're making sure you have a clear understanding of what that looks like in different scenarios, and you're making sure that you're testing those appropriately. One other component of that is obviously developing the test cases around that. Once you've done that, you need to identify the appropriate users to test these scenarios. And I think a lot of times people don't take enough time to understand who the end users are day to day and involve those users if possible in this process, because if you do that, those people have the most knowledge of the system and have the most knowledge of the day to day within those system functionalities. And they will definitely have a better experience testing because they can do these things more efficiently. As users are going through this, just make sure that they're documenting evidence appropriately for successful test completion, and then you're tracking any issues that come up and making sure you resolve those as necessary, going back and tweaking roles as needed. If you have to go back down to that build phase and really do a reconsideration of a role to make something work, you're going through the same testing and approvals to get that back into the user acceptance testing phase. Once that's completed and you have proper user acceptance, you'll have to then go into user mapping. So user mapping, I think Lauren also touched briefly on this, but that's making sure that you have all of your end users that will be using your security roles mapped to those new security roles and understand what that horizon looks like as you're approaching go live. It's also important during this to go ahead and conduct another benchmarking SOD analysis. That'll make sure that going into first going into pilot or day in the life and then going into go live, you're aware of what risk you'll be facing, and if anything is unexpected that you see, you can go ahead and remediate that before introducing that into your production environment. Once you've done that, you're ready to select a group for a day in the life. So DITL, day in the life, we call that pilot a lot of times. That's where you select a subset of users, somewhat similar to the UAT users. You try to identify people across the different business processes, and you're going to send them into production with the updated roles now that you've gone through user acceptance testing, and let them function with these roles for a couple of weeks or maybe a month, depending on what kind of window you want to set up. And basically that's just to let them go through the nuances of their day-to-day operations that sometimes may be missed in UAT. And if any issues come up in functionality, you can address those appropriately and then go back, tweak those roles, and do anything that you need to do there before moving that into production and expanding any potential problems to the whole user base. All right, Holly, you can move on to the next slide. So once the pilot testing has been certified by that initial subset of users, you're ready to go live. So before formal migration can begin to the production environment, it's definitely important to plan accordingly so that you're setting yourself up for success. And what I mean by that is ideally making sure you have an established cutover plan, making sure you have a support strategy in place to support your end users during the cutover, after the cutover, and into hypercare. And then making sure that you have communication plans in place too, and a process for that, so that you're communicating what the roles are intended to do, how they go about accessing support if they have any issues with that, and what expectations are for the hypercare window. One other thing that I think is important to call out during this process of going live is making sure that you have a rollback plan. So a rollback plan for security means that I've taken a snapshot of security before we started this process and made sure that I've captured what used to be the security model that you were using day to day. And that makes sure that if I get to this phase and I go live and a user has any kind of critical issue where they can't perform their day to day, I can then go back to my rollback plan, give them that access they used to have, and they can function in the interim, making sure they can do their day to day while we're fixing the issue involved with the new role. So I just wanted to call that out. Once you've got all that in place and you're ready to go live, you're going to go through cutover and formally go live after you've gotten your approvals. You'll then decommission your legacy roles and ensure that users are aware of that hypercare window and they've been communicated to appropriately as you deploy the roles. Then from that go live stage, you're going to go into the hypercare window. Hypercare can vary client to client. We've seen several different setups depending on the budget and the appetite, but we would suggest trying to have 24/7 support available for people for 2 to 4 weeks. I think it's also important to consider within that any significant business impacts that are business events that will impact the business or have the potential to in that window, making sure that you consider time zones and making sure you're considering your user base. So you may not be functioning only in Eastern or only in whatever business unit that you tested in. You may be now supporting the entire user base, and you want to make sure that you're there to support them as they start using their new roles. I also think it's important to try to at least incorporate month end into pilot or into hypercare. So what I mean by that obviously is month end, closing process, et cetera, but there are a lot of nuances in that process that may not even be captured after a month of normal day-to-day operations. So you want to make sure that you're capturing those activities as part of that, and you're able to resolve any issues in that window and able to correct that for the months ahead. Once the issue resolution from hypercare is complete, or at least is nearing completion, your window is closing, you want to then go back and ensure that all of your outstanding issues have a resolution plan, and they're planned to be closed by the window, or at least transition to a team to support that. You want to make sure that you've updated the design documents of any roles you've had to tweak, and then you want to make sure you have a current state of your user mapping so that you know who has what access, and perform an additional SOD analysis on that to make sure that you have a go forward look at what security risk exists in your production environment. All right, Holly, you can move forward to the next slide. So now that we've kind of explained at a high level what the implementation looks like, we wanted to share a couple of best practices we have with you. One of those being design consistency. So we just want to make sure that it's clear and concise across the organization what is expected of the developers of the role, making sure you're sticking to a consistent approach. And that way you can make sure that you have visibility and scalability among all components of your role design. So that's what we mean in that bucket of design consistency. Within naming convention, or what we mean by naming convention is making sure that you have a consistent naming convention among all of your custom roles. And that's just making sure that everybody has awareness of what the role can do. And you can even add additional components to that, like risk rankings, et cetera, if you need additional identifiers for your roles. You don't want to duplicate functions across different roles if you can help it. Sometimes this isn't possible because of system limitations, but if that can be avoided, it is best practice. And then consider using an SOD assessment tool. So Lauren will touch on this in a minute as well, but if you can use an SOD assessment tool, it will make the process of doing your analysis much more efficient, and you won't have to do any of the manual matching of security that you had to do to analyze that before. And there's a lot of manual error that can be involved in that. So it definitely can improve accuracy as well. And that can be used during the implementation and afterwards. And that's just basically our best practices recommendations there. So if anybody has any questions on any of those specifically, I'm happy to take those offline and have a one-on-one in a different session. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Lauren, to talk about governance.
Yes, thanks, Ryan. And just a reminder, Holly did put in the chat, if you do have any questions on what we've covered so far, please put it in the chat and then we'll get to it at the end. We've got a couple more slides to get through until then. Okay, so the last piece that we wanted to talk about of those three components is security governance and implementing that. So Holly, could you hit the next slide? So right here, we've got 6 key pillars that we really want to lay out as far as maintaining and developing a strong security governance platform. The first one being SOD management. I know we've talked about that quite a bit, but this is a key one that we want to highlight. A lot of times, this is where organizations tend to miss some access, or they don't have a good handle on what the risks are that they need to manage, and then user access can kind of snowball from there, creating a insecure environment. Then there's role management. So how are we maintaining the roles that are allowing access? Are we updating the roles? Are we creating new roles? And one of the key components of this is the ownership on who will be making those updates based on either user access appropriateness or other SOD risks that were outlined within our rule set. Then we've got user access reviews. I believe everyone's pretty familiar with that, whether it's quarterly, biannually, annually for your organization, making sure that you stay on top of that and removing any access that's inappropriate during those reviews. Any elevated or temporary privileged access, sometimes this is firefighter access, managing that. Either access is limited for a short period of time and only to the users that need to perform those specific job functions. Then we have the user provisioning management, which we've talked a lot about today. As far as the SOD tool integration, a lot of times, like Brian was saying, when you do implement a tool like this, it can really help perform these upfront and initial SOD checks to make sure prior to provisioning a user access that you're fully aware of what risks as far as sensitive access and segregation of duties conflicts that user will be getting, so we can stay either on top of the mitigating control. Maybe you decide against it, and then that's when your role management process will kick in. And then lastly, just overall governance, your IT change management and other ITGCs from an audit perspective. We want to make sure that the team is fully aware of what to expect and that the policies are there to enforce and really sustain the environment that you've created from a clean slate. All right, next slide. So either from a fresh design or redesigning of that current application, we need to understand and take an inventory of all your current challenges, your pain points, the issues that you're facing, and then tie these to your end or your future state goals. From there, you're able to understand what the application's capabilities are, the options that you have, and then identify the gaps from your current state to what the tool can do. This will help you prioritize what needs to be done in the short term versus the long term. A lot of times we recommend getting those quick wins out of and taking care of right away, and then parking any of the longer term issues that you can deal with on a long-term roadmap. All right, next slide. So a couple other security design considerations that we wanted to touch on. This really has to do with who are the right players, the right people that need to be involved in these conversations, either from the scoping all the way to actually performing these actions, and then the approvals. Next slide. So here we have key project stakeholders identified and grouped into different buckets. We have our functional leaders. These are really the folks that are going to help scope some of those key risks that we are facing in the business. And ultimately, they'll assign those mitigating controls as far as the segregation of duties conflicts. Then you have your control teams or your internal audit. I know there's quite a few auditors on the phone right now. Audit can help support the design of these security governance processes and provide feedback on the SOD risks that are being looked at and then ultimately scoped, as well as mitigating controls. But there's always that fine line as far as providing feedback and then actually designing. So we want to make sure that that's being considered. But involving internal audit or those controls teams up front is very beneficial to the success of the projects. Then we have the security teams who will ultimately be performing the task, either building the new roles, changing the roles, assigning or removing user access, and making sure that they're looped in and understand the support that's going to be needed, that we're taking into consideration any of their feedback as far as their understanding about what the technical ask is from there, and then that helps you plan from a project perspective how long this is going to take and really what the level of effort is. Then on the top right, we've got that risk management and GRC team. They'll work closely typically with the audit, but they'll be providing feedback as well. Then you've got your end users who, if applicable to what you're trying to do, they might be performing that UAT what Ryan was getting into earlier. So we want to hear what their pain points are, because really those are the people that are most in tune to what the issues are and then what the current process is. And then lastly, your project management, making sure everything is running smoothly and that issues are raised accordingly. Okay, next slide. And then just a couple of keys to success. From an executive leadership standpoint, it's crucial to have buy-in from all parties, but really especially from the top of the organization. This really promotes that culture and openness to the change. Really, we've seen the most successful projects having that support and buy-in from executive leadership to get all parties on board and getting excited about this new opportunity to create clean environments. You want to make sure that the right audience is there. We've talked about this a lot, but looping in the right folks, whether in the scoping decisions and the discussions all the way from identifying risks, this is really key to getting the right feedback, and then this makes the process more efficient in the downstream. A lot of times this means including the right members of the business or IT to make these decisions. Third, thorough UAT testing. This really does help minimize the business interruption, and it can act as an additional training for end users just to get more comfortable with the tool as they go through it. Ultimately, this will lead to a very smooth go live. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing our issues appropriately. What we talked about a little bit ago. What are our quick wins that we can take care of now, or what's something that's going to be a larger level of effort that we need to park for either a separate project or a different time when we can get the right team members involved. This really does help prevent any scope creep and avoid further delays as you tackle this project. All right, next slide, because we've got last polling question up. So I'll give you all a minute to read and answer the polling question. Holly, what's our countdown at?
Let's give it another 15 seconds.
We can do that.
And I will give just one last reminder. If anyone's got any questions, please send them in now.
Yeah, if we don't have time to answer before the end of the presentation, like Ryan mentioned, we're happy to connect with anyone offline to get those questions answered.
All right, and I am going to end the poll.
Great, so it looks like most of you in your organizations are able to prioritize application security, so that's great to see. we've got 78% as yes, 6% no, and then the 17% is a maybe. Thanks, Holly. Okay, so last slide here, just a couple of key takeaways before we go into Q&A. I know we've got 3 minutes left. Out of the box are those seated roles that have those inherent SOD conflicts or those intra-role conflicts. We want to make sure that we're avoiding those just to reintroduce issues within our security environment. Identifying your appropriate SOD rule sets and sensitive access rule sets, and then creating that risk ranking framework to assign to each of those business processes or conflicts. Making sure we're designing, building, and testing those roles and mapping to the business requirements. We want to make sure we implement strong security processes. So after you do all this work, how do we maintain and continue a clean environment? And that way you're not having to do this within another 6 months or so. And then establishing those long-term governance procedures, again, to manage that, the environment. So with that said, we will open it up now to the Q&A portion of the presentation. Holly, I'm not sure if there's any in the chat, or if someone wants to put it in now, we can go ahead and answer those questions. Okay, I will take that as we covered absolutely everything. Again, thank you all so much for the opportunity to be able to speak today. If you think of anything, you can shoot us an email or get in contact with us, and we can answer those questions, even if they come up within, in the next day or two, or even into the new year. Anything else, Martin or Holly, before we go ahead, or Lucinda, that we want to touch on before we end today's presentation?
No, I think I appreciate everybody's time. And like Lauren said, if there's any questions, please reach out. Feel free to reach out through Lucinda as well. And we're happy to answer some questions as needed.
Thank you so much, guys. We really did enjoy it, and look for another upcoming presentation in January. I believe it's January 13th. I'm not looking at my calendar at the moment. We will have a 2CPE also presented by Protiviti, ERP implementation risk, and 10 common security mistakes and how to avoid them. So go ahead and keep an eye out for the registration email. It should be coming out soon.
All right, well, thank you all, and happy holidays.
Thank you.